What if I told you there's a country in Africa that was created by America? A land where freed slaves were sent not to thrive, but to vanish from U.S. society. A nation born with American ideals but buried under centuries of betrayal. This is the untold truth of Liberia, a place they hoped you would never ask about. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Idea. In the early 1800s, America was at a crossroads. Slavery was still legal, but the number of freed black individuals in the North was growing. White elites feared a multiracial society. Their answer? Deportation. The American Colonization Society, ACS, emerged as a coalition of abolitionists, racists, and politicians who strangely agreed on one thing: black people didn't belong in America. The ACS argued that freed African Americans would face endless discrimination and poverty in the United States. But many historians believe it was a convenient excuse to remove them from American soil. The movement wasn't about helping black people. It was about cleansing the American social landscape. In 1821, the ACS organized its first voyage to West Africa. A group of black settlers, some of them born in America, were sent to create a new colony. They arrived on the coast of what would become Liberia. They were promised a new life, but were immediately faced with disease, famine, and conflict with native tribes. Despite the hardships, the idea of Liberia grew. Backed by religious groups, U.S. naval forces, and wealthy donors, the ACS continued to send freedmen across the Atlantic. Few survived, but those who did began planting the seeds of a new nation, one that mirrored America but in foreign soil. Chapter 2. Building a Nation on Foreign Soil. Once established, the settlers, now called Americo-Liberians, sought to recreate the only system they had known: America. They wore Western suits, held elections, and practiced Christianity. But instead of integrating with the indigenous tribes, they imposed their authority, forming a new ruling elite. Malaria and other tropical diseases wiped out a large portion of the early settlers. Those who survived saw themselves not as Africans, but as civilizers of the uncultured. This mindset created deep divisions between the settlers and the native peoples, whose cultures and governance were dismissed. In 1847, Liberia declared its independence. The Americo-Liberians drafted a constitution modeled after the United States. Monrovia, named after U.S. President James Monroe, became the capital. Liberia became the first African republic, but it was governed like a mini-America, only for a few. Despite their minority status, the Americo-Liberians dominated every aspect of national life. They controlled the government, the economy, and even the land. Native Liberians were rarely consulted or included in national decisions. The result was a fragile unity built on exclusion. Chapter 3. Liberia and the U.S. A complicated partnership. Although the United States never formally colonized Liberia, its fingerprints were all over the country. The American Colonization Society ran Liberia like a corporate project. U.S. Navy ships guarded its shores. American missionaries built its schools. And American businesses eyed its resources. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Liberia was seen as an extension of American influence. When Firestone set up the world's largest rubber plantation in Liberia in the 1920s, it gained near complete control over the economy. Liberians worked under grueling conditions to meet America's industrial demands. During World War II, Liberia became a strategic base for the Allies. In exchange for access, the U.S. built roads, ports, and infrastructure. But after the war, interest faded. Liberia was left with debt, limited industrial capacity, and growing inequality between the elite and the masses. Despite the reliance on U.S. support, Liberia was largely ignored by American policymakers unless strategic interests were at stake. This love-hate relationship created dependency, resentment, and confusion about Liberia's true identity. Was it sovereign, or still under America's shadow? Chapter 4. The rule of the few. For over 130 years, Liberia was ruled by a single party, the true Whig Party. Dominated by Americo-Liberians, this political machine controlled the presidency, legislature, and judiciary. Power remained in the hands of a small elite, disconnected from the vast majority of the population. Social divisions were stark. Americo-Liberians lived in cities dressed in European fashion and spoke polished English. Indigenous Liberians were considered backward and were excluded from politics, education, and land ownership. Liberia, though a republic in name, functioned like an oligarchy. Education was limited for native tribes. The elite sent their children to American universities. A culture of nepotism and favoritism took root. Elections were often rigged, and dissent was crushed. Corruption was rampant, yet hidden under the facade of Western civility. The result was a powder keg. The majority of Liberians had no real stake in their government. Tensions simmered for decades. The world saw a peaceful republic. Inside, it was a pressure cooker of inequality and resentment waiting to explode. Chapter 5. The coup that changed everything. On April 12, 1980, the illusion of stability shattered. Samuel Doe, a 28-year-old army sergeant from the indigenous Kran tribe, led a bloody coup that killed President William Tolbert and ended Americo-Liberian rule. For the first time, Liberia was in the hands of its native majority. Doe's rise was celebrated by many as justice long delayed. The marginalized finally had a voice. But power, once seized, quickly corrupted. Doe suspended the constitution, ruled by decree, and eliminated rivals. Ethnic favoritism replaced elitism. Initially, the U.S. backed Doe, seeing him as a Cold War ally. He received millions in aid, but as his regime became more violent and unpredictable, Western support waned. Political opponents were tortured. Entire villages were massacred. The promise of change gave way to chaos. Liberia spiraled into a dark era. The coup that was meant to restore equality instead plunged the nation into fear and instability. And America? It stood by, unsure whether to embrace or disown the monster it had helped empower. Chapter 6. Civil War and Collapse. After Doe's assassination in 1990, Liberia descended into one of Africa's most brutal civil wars. Charles Taylor, a former government official turned warlord, took center stage. His forces fought for control, funded by diamonds and fear. Child soldiers became the face of the conflict. Entire towns were razed. Human rights abuses were rampant. Massacres, rape, and famine defined daily life. The nation collapsed into anarchy. Peacekeeping efforts failed repeatedly. Liberians fled by the thousands. Neighboring countries were overwhelmed with refugees. The U.S., despite its historic ties, offered little intervention beyond humanitarian aid. The world watched in horror but acted with hesitation. By the early 2000s, over 250,000 people were dead. The land of liberty had become a land of blood. Liberia's dream was in ashes. But amid the rubble, a new hope would rise, led by a woman with global vision and deep Liberian roots. Chapter 7. A Fragile Peace and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. In 2005, Liberia made history by electing Africa's first female president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. A Harvard-educated economist, Sirleaf had once worked for the World Bank and the United Nations. She represented competence, reconciliation, and the possibility of a new Liberia. Her government focused on rebuilding. Roads were repaired. Schools reopened. Hospitals received international funding. The international community, especially the U.S., re-engaged through aid, trade, and diplomacy. Yet challenges remained. Corruption persisted. Unemployment stayed high. Many war criminals were never prosecuted. The wounds of war were deep and healing was slow. But Sirleaf restored some stability, and Liberia began to re-enter the global stage. Under her leadership, Liberia survived the deadly Ebola outbreak of 2014. Her administration's transparency and coordination with global health partners were praised. Liberia wasn't perfect, but it had clawed back from the edge of oblivion. Chapter 8. Modern Liberia and the U.S. Legacy. Today, Liberia remains one of the most U.S.-influenced nations in Africa. Its currency is tied to the U.S. dollar. Its language is English. Its flag resembles America's, and its laws echo U.S. governance. But the legacy is bittersweet. Youth unemployment is over 70%. Infrastructure remains fragile. Corruption eats away at institutions, and the divide between elites and everyday citizens remains. The country is independent, yet deeply dependent on foreign aid. America still sees Liberia as a partner. Military cooperation, health programs, and education exchanges continue. But many Liberians ask, will the U.S. ever invest in Liberia's success the way it invested in its creation? Liberia is a land of contradictions, African yet American, free yet burdened, hopeful yet scarred. It is a nation seeking to reclaim its destiny, but still haunted by the terms of its birth. Chapter 9. What they don't want you to know. What if Liberia wasn't just a humanitarian experiment, but a political solution to America's race problem? What if the history of Liberia reveals the true depth of America's racial anxiety in the 1800s? Liberia was never just about liberation. It was about removal. It was about silencing a community by sending it far away. The U.S. exported its racial tensions to Africa, and the world never questioned it. Today, Liberia's story remains largely untold in American classrooms. Most U.S. citizens know little of its existence, let alone its connection to their own history. This silence is deliberate, because if Liberia's full story were known, it would force America to confront its past. Liberia is more than a country. It is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when idealism meets imperialism, when liberty is promised, but only for a few, and when history is rewritten to hide uncomfortable truths. Like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from Africa and beyond. What surprised you most about Liberia? Drop a comment below.